Thank you, Natan, and thank you to IFSES for the opportunity to speak at this joint session. I'm going to talk a bit about the fellowship training and our current status in the United States. Okay. Currently, we have about 20 years of history of training minimally invasive surgery fellows in this country. I was very fortunate to be one of the earliest fellows trained in the U.S. I was the first Duke fellow and then went on to lead that program and have remained involved in fellowship training throughout my entire career. But over the last almost 20 years, what we've now done is trained an entire generation of surgeons who have exceptional skills and knowledge in the area of laparoscopy. If we look currently at our status regarding fellowship programs, we have programs that are fully accredited through the MIS Fellowship Council that are in the numbers in the low 100s. There actually are close to 200 fellowship programs that somehow touch laparoscopy. The focus might be on flexible endoscopy with some laparoscopy, bariatrics with laparoscopy, but for the accredited MIS programs, we're currently just over 100. And you can see over the past 3 years, or 3 years accreditation, 2 years, so on and so forth. One program was not accredited, one has been suspended, and then others are under evaluation. I think there are a couple of things on this slide looking at the statistics for the match for fellowship programs that are important. 124 or 126 programs basically involved in the match. For the positions available in the U.S., 173 each of the last couple of years, and then the applicants are now approaching 200 applicants. 2008 were the completed statistics for the previous year. This 2008 star the statistics for that actual year. So it is back-to-back years, even though both say 2008. But currently we're having around 200 people apply for MIS fellowship programs. And then of those, about 50 or so do not get a position. Yet when we look at the number of places that are certified positions, we end up with about 30 or so that do not fill. So there's a mismatch here, meaning at the end of the match, there's still some positions available, and there are some people who do not get the positions. Sometimes there are lack of qualifications that are issues, or they simply chose the wrong fellowship, and therefore they get together later. But also we have many international trainees who come to the U.S. for training, and if they did not get a match position, they acquire some of the positions that were unfilled at that time. But there are significant changes, and if there's nothing else that you take away from this talk, realize that there are new rules and regulations in this country related to how industry can give money to institutions. And as of the coming year, all industry funding of fellowships has been planned to cease. And that means that at least 200 fellowship programs, not just in laparoscopy, but also bariatrics, colorectal surgery, thoracic, other places that are funded by industry were having to go away because there was nothing else to fund these programs unless a surgeon chose to pay from their own pocket. Most institutions, most hospitals, most medical schools did not have resources budgeted to take over the funding of these fellowships, or they have refused to do so. So we've been in danger of losing essentially the bulk of our fellowship training in the U.S. if some changes did not occur. Now, why is that occurring? A lot has to do with the conflict of interest issues. It has to do with the perception that if someone funds a fellowship at a hospital, that influences the purchasing of their products. Perhaps that's true in some situations. In other places, it's not true, but there are enough scrutiny and new rules that this was eliminating the ability for the industry to come to my medical school, my university, and give money to support a fellowship with or without purchasing. So we had to do something quickly. Fortunately, some of our wise and energetic leaders have worked with our industry colleagues to establish now a foundation into which the money can be given. The foundation then can distribute the money out in a way that is non-political and industry has no influence over where the money goes, that allows funding for fellowships to be maintained, and it means that most of our fellowships will remain alive because the money goes in and industry is at arm's length from the influence to a direct institution. Do I believe that all fellowships will remain funded? No. I think we're going to see some go away. We're going to see it become more competitive, and probably those fellowships that are accredited and that reach very high standards will be the ones most likely to get the money in the future. That could be a good thing in that our quality continues to improve, But it's a bad thing in that opportunities and positions will probably go away and fewer individuals will have opportunity to get this advanced training. The new entity is named the Foundation for Surgical Fellowships. If you train fellows, if you send your students into U.S. fellowships, you can go through the Fellowship Council website, the same place they've been applying for the last 3 or 4 years, and this new information will be available very soon. We're soon going to have the details of how do you apply if you run a fellowship and how do you apply to actually obtain a position in the future. There are a lot of factors that are forcing the change in how we actually educate in the U.S. and how we train our residents. These apply all over the world, and that is that we have more complex technology. Minimally invasive surgery has truly changed the landscape of surgery. Robotics has been introduced and is becoming more important. We have a medical legal environment that requires increased supervision, an enlarging body of knowledge that's difficult for all of us to keep up with all that's being published and produced. In our country, the restrictions on resident work hours has dramatically changed how our educational process takes place. And then, as I've just described, finances or money has a huge impact. Our current and emerging environments actually mandate that more and more of our education takes place outside of the operating room or away from the bedside. And this training needs to be designed not just as empty activity, but activity that optimizes the experience that the trainee has when they do step into the operating room. That bedside teaching cannot go away, will not go away. We all have trained in this apprenticeship model where we stand across the table from our teacher, our mentor, our professor, and that will continue as far as I can see into the future. But we can use other modalities, such as Miran just described, of remote teaching, looking at operations from distant sites, video technologies, and here you see a live operation with multiple views as people are being instructed as to what's taking place. When we look at the 80-hour work week that our residents have, and in many institutions that applies to fellows also, it means that they have to train outside of those 80 hours. They have to do some of this on their own. But human nature is such, they're probably not going to be doing that unless we hold them accountable. And there has to be testing, and there has to be a reward for accomplishing developing knowledge and developing skill sets outside the operating room, and that reward can be allowing them to do procedures, and there have to be consequences such as failure to advance through the program if those skills are not developed, sometimes outside the operating room. I was not allowed to tie knots in the operating room until I knew how to tie knots. I didn't learn that in the operating room. I tied knots on my belt loops, I tied on my furniture, I stopped at red lights in traffic and tied on the steering wheel. I had knots everywhere. I was criticized heavily by my wife at the time for all of these sutures and strings hanging from everywhere. I learned to tie outside the operating room before I could apply it inside. We have advanced skills and abilities we have to learn outside the OR. Robotics certainly cannot be learned for the first time at the bedside. You have to train, you have to understand the device and how to use it. The simple trainer boxes, though, are still extremely useful in terms of tying knots and suturing and developing skills, spatial relations, and we can't lose the inexpensive, simple training mechanisms. The animal laboratories today, at least in this country, remain very, very important because while simulation has made great advances, it has not replaced the use of tissue. And whether it's animals or fresh tissue cadaver, there's some skill sets we need to learn on tissue, so it still remains a big part of our training. But simulation is coming along quickly. We started out with these simulators where we would do things like running a code with someone with a cardiac arrest. But more and more our laparoscopic simulators, our ultrasound simulators are coming along with technology and programs that are very, very realistic. And many of you may have used those in the exhibit hall this time where you saw great advances from what we knew 5 years ago. But one of the points that I want to make, and it goes back to that teaching and mentoring, and I think for this audience is so important. Here you see me operating with Juan Picol of Argentina. I cannot tell you how much I personally have gained by traveling around the world and operating with skilled and respected surgeons. And as I've stood in the hallways here, people from Uruguay tell me about the importance in their life of going to Japan for 3 months to train. all over Europe. Dr. Parasat and I were talking about my first trip to Bordeaux and to learn from surgeons in other locales. And wherever we have the opportunity to go and gain that knowledge from one another and stand across a table and learn new skills and new techniques and new ways of innovation, I think we have to continue to do that. And throughout my career, I've sent my fellows internationally for periods of time during their training to try to grasp some of those experiences. The ultimate target is going to be competence and measurable targets, but it's not just for trainees. That will be applied to us also. But we as surgeons know better than any other group what skill sets are needed, and we need to actually set the standards, not have government and attorneys set the standards for us. One successful mechanism for training people is to break the procedure into components. We say, I have to go fast, I have to earn money, I have to produce a lot. Well, we can't give a new fellow the entire procedure from day one. So we take things like a Nissen and we break it into components. And we tell them, today you'll learn the first 2 steps. I will do the rest of the operation. Next week you'll work on steps 3 and 4. And we mature them gradually to where they can do the entire operation in a reasonable amount of time. When we have curricula for our fellows and our residents, we try to include didactic teaching. We have reading assignments. We use multimedia. DVDs and the videos are very important, especially the night before the operation. The simulators, the hands-on boxes, we need to test skills and knowledge, and then evaluate the application in the clinical setting, back to our traditional subjective evaluation. The development of this type of curriculum for trainees is very, very time-consuming. I'm not trying to say it's easy, and it does take a great deal of commitment from those teachers to develop a quality curriculum. And there's not a single curriculum that applies to all of us. However, there are common elements we can take that will apply, whether it's across different countries or across different programs within the U.S. In conclusion, the changes that have impacted the way that we train surgeons and residents and fellows can be viewed as threats, or they can be viewed as challenges to be faced and attacked to make us better in what we do. I do believe that the future of fellowship training in the U.S. remains necessary and very promising. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It's a beautiful presentation.